Our featured speaker today is Swain, Environmental Horticulture Advisor for Marin and Sonoma counties. He brings a breadth of perspectives to his job, having worked in the industry in the mid-90s and then working on tree diseases in both research and extension positions at UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and UC Cooperative Extension. His work on trees and the wildland urban interface has dragged him into the world of fire research, where he's doing his best to figure stuff out without anyone getting burned. And I'll add just a note. I connected with Stephen shortly before the Southern California wildfires broke out last month, actually. So this meeting topic has turned out to be very timely. I'll note that wildfires and climate change related disasters are a topic of personal interest to me as well. And unfortunately, these disasters are occurring at greater frequency and higher intensity. I had an opportunity to assist with the state of California's wildfire ash and debris removal program in 2019 following the Woolsey fire in LA and Ventura counties. And I've shared information about this meeting, this presentation with some of my colleagues through that work. And I'm pleased to see that some of those folks are able to join today to learn and participate in the discussion. So today, we'll get to hear Stephen cover the interplay of fire, weed management, and ecosystem impacts. So I'll pass it over to you.
When most people want to talk about fire, they often have a goal that is usually personal safety and the safety of their house. And the first thing they seem to want to talk about are the plants and landscaping. And I think that the data pretty clearly show that it's not necessarily about the plants. So, what we often hear, I've heard many times, is my neighbor has eucalyptus trees and I'm worried they're going to basically explode or something when if the fire comes through and it's threatening us all. And I don't think that's really. We've got some very strong evidence that is simply not the case. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on ukes necessarily, but what if it's really more about the houses? So I know we're going to talk about landscapes and we're going to get there, but I want to start and almost kind of finish with, if you're looking at the landscape as your first step, you're missing a very critical step, and that is the house and the design of the landscape overall. So I'm not, just to let you know, I'm not cherry picking this stuff. This is a picture of the Paradise Fire, image from the LA Times. And people said, well, the fire came from the forest. Well, and that's not entirely untrue, but, but if you look here, those trees didn't burn. And yet every house in the image is gone. And there are a few trees that got scorched that happened to have been in the middle of the houses. But it was the houses that scorched the trees, not vice versa. And if you think I'm cherry picking my data, I'm not. I've got pictures from the LA fire that we can include. That's not in the presentation. But this goes back to the Script Ranch fire. We hear about eucalyptus trees again, for example, all the time and how dangerous they are. Here we have houses, many of which were burned at a temperature exceeding 2,000 degrees. They were within 20 feet of eucalyptus trees, or 30 feet, and yet the eucalyptus trees didn't burn. How is that possible if these trees are that dangerous? Again, we've known about this for a long time. That was like a 95 burn, right? 30 years ago now. This is the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa. Again, part of the picture. It is not the most important thing. So this is not a talk that talks about structures and fire. If you guys want to hear about structures and fire, we can call the local fire department. We can talk to Steve Quarles. I'll introduce him in a few minutes. He's not actually part of the meeting, but I'll tell you who he is and all that other stuff. And we are here to talk about the landscape, and it is a factor that we do need to consider. So I'm not trying to discount it entirely. I just think it's not where we should start. So landscape can clearly have an issue. This is bishop pine, and bishop pine is a fire-adapted species. This is a picture after the Vision Fire came through in the mid-1990s, and the Vision Fire was the first fire that had been there in about 50 years. The cones of this pine species open, they have to have fire to open them and release the seeds. So there were cones waiting for 50 years to release their seeds. And so when the fire did come through, 50 years of seeds had been building up, waiting to germinate, and they did, and this is what we got. But you'll notice this is really tightly packed. You can't walk between these trees without cutting yourself a path. This is also bishop pine, and this pine is probably going to be very difficult to ignite. Now, granted, it's in a golf course, so it's well maintained. But the point here is that if you just look at species like plant lists, it's not telling you a complete story. In fact, most plant lists are pretty much meaningless. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But what I want to point out here is it's community structure that's important. These bishop pines, this is a serious fire hazard. You can't escape through this. The fire will burn very rapidly through this. It's a problem. It's the same species as this tree, and yet this tree is almost impervious to fire. So we shouldn't be looking at plant species as a way to minimize our fire risk, because it's not about species, it's about community structure. And when I'm talking about the plant community and our built community. So as far as plants go, we are in charge of that. We design the landscape, we maintain the landscape, and that is where really the buck kind of stops. There are a few plants that are maybe measurably more flammable. We can talk about that. But I want to point out a couple things. Plants, especially bigger plants like trees, all plants manage water. Bigger plants like trees with really big root systems have lots of different access routes to water. And so they manage water the way we learned in grade school, right? The sun comes up, the plant roots take up water, they photosynthesize, the plant makes sugar from the photosynthate, and the water flows up through the tree and out the leaves. What we don't often get to hear much about is the community underground. At night, that plant is still pulling up a little bit of water. Yes, more slowly, definitely, but the water is still being distributed, and it's trading with all kinds of members of the community, mostly fungi, a little bit of bacteria as well. And the plant is exuding sugar water, and the fungi and the bacteria are trading that sugar water for nutrients. And when the sun comes up, the tree pulls all that water back in, and it gets all kinds of fertilizers, phosphorus, potassium, all the things you've heard about, calcium, and it can grow. So there is a community underground. So when I talk about plant communities, we're including community in a broader sense. So when we talk about plants and we talk about what plants what plants should we pick? I'm saying it doesn't matter. But some people are probably scratching their head and saying, I know there are plants that are less flammable than other plants. And you're right. We can tell without any scientific data, some plants are less flammable. We could include, say, petunia, Swiss chard, and aloe vera, right? Those plants are really not going to burn well. And we can see that. So that's what these big words at the top of the graph are. This is how we perceive things. And people can typically perceive things. So I'm going to go back and forth between statistical terminology and just regular terminology. We could say that plant is definitely less flammable than the others, right? And that's about when people perceive this, and this is a sociological study that I've got the graph from, it is we can perceive about 2 standard deviations of distance, and we can say that is clearly, I don't need science to tell me that, right? Well, 2% is about, 98% confidence interval, so this works out perfectly. On the other hand, we can say some plants are definitely more flammable than others. And that also tends to be about the 2% range. So that's what we're seeing, a standard bell curve, right? As far as the stuff in the middle, we can say, yeah, that might be a little more flammable, or it might be a little, but there's so many different variables in there. Water status, the outside temperature, what wind is going, what do we define as, what are we actually measuring? Are we measuring time to ignition, or the amount of heat released by that plant once it begins burning, or some combination thereof? And it's really kind of fuzzy about what you can say definitely or not definitely. Okay, so point made. The point here is that when we look at plant lists, nobody can even agree on what factors are is it time to ignition that's really most important? I mean, how many, because embers are what drive most fires. So if you just put embers on something, will it ignite? That's going to be that's a pretty valuable metric. But if the plant just ignites and fizzles out and doesn't do anything after that, it's not that important because it's not contributing much to fire risk. So it's not only got to ignite, but it's got to be able to have a sustained burn after that. So, and then that all depends on water status. So how do you evaluate all this? It gets very complicated. So that's why people can't agree on how to put this in. So the point here is that while there are definitely some plants that are less flammable and definitely plants that are more flammable, the science isn't very straightforward on how to do that. And when we talk about the things we can detect, it's about 2% of the plant palette. So as long as you're happy landscaping with Swiss chard, aloe vera, and petunias, you're fine. We don't need a plant list to tell us about that, but that's not what people want. And there's a good reason that's not what people want, because plants serve a ton of different roles in the landscape. And we're going to explore that during this talk, right? Flammability isn't the only role. That's why we don't just want to plant landscape with petunias, aloe vera, and Swiss chard. And so people start saying, well, I want a bigger palette because I want to do other things with my yard besides just worry about fire. If I was only worried about fire, I'd just pave the whole lot. And then it'd probably be pretty fireproof. That reintroduces all these other plant species, and everybody says, what about this? Can I plant this? Can I plant that? Can I plant that? And that's where all this other stuff comes in, and science just doesn't have the tools to be able to answer those questions right now. So enough talk about what we can't do. Let's talk just a little about what we can do. So some of again, Steve Quarles doing some work on flammability. And in this case, he was doing some work on mulch in that zone 0 to 5 feet. And we were able to come up with some findings. I participated in that study. Some of the findings were kind of surprising, and others weren't. I was not surprised that composted materials were less flammable than just raw wood chips. Compost is the process of breaking down organic materials into humus and other soil-like particles. And so as wood breaks down, we typically see it. Soil doesn't typically burn very well. And we found out that finer materials don't burn as well as coarse materials do. That surprised me. I was surprised to find out that coarse materials ignited more easily because I thought bigger materials, bigger chunks would have less surface area, so they'd be harder to ignite. And while that may be true, and we can go into the details of this, it actually has more to do with airflow underneath the very top layers of surface, and that's and the finer materials kind of restrict that airflow enough that fire has a hard time there. It snuffs itself. So the safest organic mulches that you can use in a landscape, that are organic, that will actually feed the soil. So you could use a rock mulch, for instance. Mulch is a very broad term. You can use almost anything and call it mulch if it covers soil. So you can use mylar mulch or paper mulch or rock mulch. But most people try to use wood chips and things that'll feed, as they break down, they'll feed the soil and they'll do something good for it. They'll help keep that soil community alive, because it is again about community. So fine organic mulches that have been composted are the best materials. The worst materials are pretty much all. Have you ever seen those chipped, dyed wood chips that, look great with mondo grass and a bunch of other things. And they come in different colors, black or rust red, or maybe gray if you're going for that look. And those, because dyes tend to be preservatives as well, those wood chips don't break down very easily. They don't feed the soil very well, and they remain flammable for long periods of time, and they burn really well. So we don't recommend their use. And fir bark also burns really well. That was a surprise to me, because it turns out that fir bark is a little like popcorn. As it burns, it kind of expands and gets lighter, and then the fire itself creates some wind currents, and the fir bark gets so light, it gets picked up by these things, and it scatters all by itself. So here's a picture of the study that we were conducting, and we're looking at a coarse composted material in this particular image. But the next image we have, that's what it looks like as it finishes, and you'll see, when we used a drip torch to light it, and where it's right next to the flames, it burns pretty well. But as the wind intensity dies down, as it moves farther from the fans, and as it moves farther out into the compost, it just kind of smolders and smokes. And that's all mulch can burn. But this is kind of what we're hoping. It doesn't mean there's no risk, but it means that it's not likely to climb walls or anything like that. If you hit something non-flammable, it stops there. As opposed to fir bark, and I know you can't see this really well, but the thing to pay attention to in this particular image is all the black spots outside of the circle. In this previous one, there were no black spots outside the circle. It burned, it smoldered through, the chip stayed there. In this one, it created enough of its own flame that the things began hopping outside the bark got light and was easily blown outside the circles, even by its own wind. It didn't even need the fans necessarily to do this. And so it was good at moving fire across the property. And if you had lawn furniture or something like that, it could set those on fire, and then it could climb into a tree or something along those lines. So fir bark's probably not the best thing. Okay, so this all gets into policy. We've all heard about, a number of different zones. We've got zone 0, which is the ember resistant zone, and it's basically about having 0 fuels in that zone or very close to it, right? And then we've got zone 1, which is 5 to 30 feet from the structure. And what I'd like to point, and we have zone 2. This picture also has zones 3 and 4. And one of the reasons I chose this image is because policy is changing and trying to change with science. And science, as we discover more and we learn science, our messaging is changing a little bit. So there are no zones 3 and 4 that we even talk about anymore. Zone 3 really is essentially with a zone 1 area, except within 10 feet of the road, if you will. So what you can think about zone 1 is extending on either side of your, especially your escape routes, right? You really want to make sure that that isn't blocked and that fire engines can come in and be safe getting to your house. So we don't really need a zone 3. We just think of zone 1 as kind of extending around your sheds and your access routes. Zone 2 is from 30 feet to 100 feet. And this is all what policy is. And that's okay. It works all right. And then zone 4 is just, we're not even going to worry about it. That's just something where we don't even worry about zone 4. So why put a number on it? I don't know. So that's policy, at least as it was, and how things have been changing. So I wanted to, I brought up Steve Quarles' name a couple times. I also want to introduce a person named Alexandra Safard. These people are people who do this kind of work. So this image is of Steve Quarles' work. Both of these researchers have been paid for the Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is a insurance institute. They want to know, they have some very specific questions. They want some pretty solid answers on, and they want data that answers their questions, and they were willing to pay for it because their potential exposure from these is huge. And I think it's a really good thing that we have insurance industry input. It makes the process much more transparent. So I really value both of these researchers' work, and so I'm not putting them up here to castigate anybody. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm going to be using a lot of this for their information for this talk. So Steve Quarles basically builds houses inside of warehouses and then has fans that control the sparks and has spark generators. And this is a picture of one of his research projects. He's built a house, he's showering it with embers, and he's seeing what lights. And this is where we get a lot of this information. This is where the zone 0 came from. You can see that there is a mulch at the base of this house that was fairly coarse and dry. And the embers caught it on fire, and it's burning right next to the house. The house has wooden cladding going all the way down to within 6 inches of the soil, and it's pretty clearly at risk. So that's what he does. And so when I talk about Steve Quarles' work, he also does work, as you've seen already, on mulch, because it's one of the factors that is key here. Alexandra Safard, and by the way, they're both in the Bay Area. So, both of them live and work in San Francisco Bay Area. I think Alexandra's in the city and Steve is in the North Bay. Alexandra Safard does GIS work. So she looks at burn patterns and how they interact with fire and what houses were lost, and tries to figure out some why was this house lost and that house wasn't, and those kinds of things. So she's using a lot of remote sensing data and those kinds of things. And this picture doesn't really do her work justice. I mean, it does show sort of her looking at the whole state and investigating different areas of the state and figuring things out along those lines. But a lot of her work is done on a much finer level, where she's looking at individual houses on a block and those kinds of things, and what kind of vegetation they had around. So that's who these names are, and I have references to a lot of their papers and things at the very end. So we'll put that up, and you'll be able to go look up a lot of these papers if you want to dive in deeper and find this information. So this is more like what defense zones look like today. We only have zone 0, zone 1, and zone 2. And even this isn't quite perfect. Zone 1 should really kind of extend along the road. Some people argue that zone 2 should extend along the road. And that really depends on the particulars of your property, maybe not necessarily something that has to be mandated. But and that's another thing that I'd like to discuss is mandates. So we're still talking about policy here. And I know we're supposed to be talking about science, but they talk to each other. So Zone 0 was supposed to go into law. They were supposed to have 2 years ago in 2023. They said, we'll have a Zone 0 law, finished by 2023. But that hasn't happened yet. So we still know that Zone 0 is critically important. We're arguing about details before we put it into law. And I can explain a little bit of that. So the messaging here, and what IBHS would really like to see, so that's the insurance agencies, is they want rules that are really simple to understand, and they want rules that are simple to inspect and enforce. And that's because people don't necessarily want to know a whole lot, in many cases, a whole lot about the details. They don't want to be bothered with one more complicated thing to figure out. They just want you to tell them, this is what you need to do. And so that's a really valid point. The problem is that, some of us scientists, we are supposed to be talking to people about what the science actually says. And there are people who are very interested in what the science actually says. And it's more complex than a Zone 0 saying you can't have anything flammable, because Zone 0 and the idea of utter non-flammability is absolutely accurate if you own a redwood-clad house built in 1906 and it has an inch or less clearance between soil and the beginning of wood. You can't have anything flammable in that zone and have anything close to reasonable safety about your house. But that, construction standards have been changing for 100 years now. So, if you own a 1972 house, it's got 6 inches of clearance between the soil grade and at least in theory, it has 6 inches of clearance between soil grade and the beginning of any wood. So now, is that okay to have mulch or anything? And the science says, well, mulch probably maybe not the best idea. If you had a very minimal layer of mulch, you could probably get away with it. Could you have aloe vera? Yeah, probably. And then if you have a place built in 2010 and it's all concrete, glass, and steel, you could probably have almost anything you wanted right next to your house, and it wouldn't set the house on fire. Whether you could get into or evacuate that house under conditions of fire is a different question entirely. So it's probably, even if you have a house that's fireproof, you probably still don't want things around your house that are highly flammable. So that's what's in front of the people at the state legislature right now. One size fits all isn't always the best model. At the same time, how do you come up with something that's applicable to most of the houses out there that's still, so it's flexible, but it's still not confusing? I don't know. And that's why, and they don't know either, apparently. So other things that are up for questions, zone 1, when you have trees that are fairly close to the house, at least 5 feet away, right? What about tree limbs over the house? And we'll talk a little bit about that later, but that is one of the things. And then in zone 2, the science is saying, well, actually out to 100 feet, when we really look at it, Safard's work shows that anything beyond about 60 feet doesn't matter. You can almost have, a blazing inferno out there. And if it's 75 feet away from your house, you're probably going to be okay, unless you're having a huge ember shower. And that's where we go back to the question of, how is your house built? Because ember showers are more a question of, how have you cleaned your gutters? What do your vents look like? How complex is your roof line? All bunch of questions along structural stuff that isn't not in our purview to talk about today. Steve can come and talk about that. So my point here is, there's a lot of gray areas that are still not adequately answered by science, and research findings aren't absolute. I'm citing some studies, I'm citing some numbers, and those are just points on a graph. We got to draw a line through it someplace. And so, and some points are outliers, and it's hard to know what's an outlier until you have enough studies to be able to say what the general trends are. So just because there's a latest study that says X doesn't mean X is the absolute truth. It just means it's one more data point we have. Okay, so about roof clearance. A 2019 study by Safard and Keeley is sometimes cited by fire departments and other people charged with inspections as justification for no branches over roofs, right? And this is secondhand information. I have not yet had a chance to speak with Alexandra Safard. I've been trying to get her to talk with me. But according to Ellie Inslee at the Sonoma Ecology Center, she did have a chance to talk with Alexandra Safard about exactly this. And she says that Alexandra directly disavowed that interpretation. The tree branches over roofs are correlated with structure loss. They do not cause structure loss, right? And what it mostly has to do with, according to Ellie, is you have to clean your gutters. And so, and if you've got a big tree over your house, that may mean you're up on your roof cleaning your gutters 3 or 4 times a year. And there's a balance between benefits and liabilities. And so you're saying, well, what benefits does a tree really bring? Okay, well, that's a great question too. Before we get there though, what you're seeing a lot of people say, and I think this is very unrealistic, is that, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. Let me back that up. Right now, policy says that you need to have 10 feet of horizontal clearance from chimneys. If you look at it a house from above, you need to have a 10-foot radius of clearance. I have not yet found supporting data for that number, but that's okay. It's not a hill I think I want to die on. Keeping tree canopies away from chimneys seems like a no-brainer to me. I don't think I'm fine leaving that where it is. But some sources have also said you need to have 10 feet of clearance from the roof edge to the moon. Or sometimes they say 10 feet of clearance in relief. In other words, looking from the side, right? Well, here I've got a graph. The red dots represent 10 feet of clearance from the side for a tree that is planted at 10 feet beyond the property, beyond the edge of the roof, right? So well outside of zone 0. And you're going to be butchering, first of all, you're going to be butchering the tree. Second of all, this is almost impossible to get a horizontal clearance of 10 feet just using pole pruners from the roof. And it's not always possible to necessarily climb every tree. This is a very difficult standard to implement, and it's a very costly standard to implement, because if it's difficult, it's going to take people time. So, maybe you say, well, just remove the tree. Okay, maybe that's a possibility. I'm going to argue that there are reasons we want trees. And I'm also going to argue that a 5-foot radius from the gutters is a much more realistic. It's very much more achievable. And we also need to look at the fact that when you have trees that are anywhere near your house, you're going to end up with leaves in them. It's not going to stop you from having to clean your gutters. You're going to have to clean your gutters. Janek Valikovic has a tree that is over 100 feet from her house, but it's a 180-foot tall redwood tree, and her gutters fill up every year with redwood needles. So you're going to have to clean regardless of what kind of clearance you have, unless we're going to wipe out all urban forests. And I think that's a really bad idea. Nonetheless, there is a difference between policy and law. And so what they're working out right now is, what do we want to have? Right now, IBHS says, well, I shouldn't even speak for IBHS. Some insurance companies are canceling people's fire insurance if they simply have a branch over a roof. And I don't think the data supports that, but they don't have to necessarily listen to data, even their own data. They can simply say, that's just too difficult. I don't want to get into these fuzzy things. You have branches over your roofs, I'm canceling you. Okay, one way to deal with this would be gutter guards. And I want to point out that gutter guards are not necessarily the guarantee people think they are. First of all, a lot of people anyway, I shouldn't say most, I don't actually know that. I see an awful lot of roofs out there, composite roofs. And composite roofs have a layer of sand over the top of them. And that sand washes off with rain and things, and it builds up in the gutters because the gutter mesh isn't fine enough to keep the sand out. What happens is, and the other thing that the gutter mesh does is it tends to slow the infiltration of water, and it tends to shade the gutters, both of which means that sand builds up in the gutters and retains moisture, and you get moss growth because moss loves shade. It grows on the north side of trees, right? So you end up with moss inside these gutters that hold the sand in place, and as it dries out, can become flammable. So if embers can make it through this mesh, now you got another problem. And now that you've got gutters on it, it's way harder to clean. The other thing I think is worth mentioning is that there are creatures that really like having moss and damp moss in the gutters, including paper wasps. So if anything pokes a hole in these gutter guards, and I know this from personal experience because my house, when I bought it, had gutter guards on it, and I had a huge problem with paper wasps. And I like paper wasps. I don't want to get rid of them because they keep yellow jackets away. That's another story. But paper wasps aren't that aggressive, except if you lift the gutter guards that their wasp nests are attached to off the thing, then they get a little ticked off. And now you're on a roof trying to clean gutters and you're being attacked by paper wasps. It's not fun. So I just want everybody to think twice before you just go for gutter guards. And you could say, oh, well, I'll get a different kind of gutter guard. Well, different kind of gutter guards may solve some of those problems. They introduce others, right? This is still much more difficult to clean than a gutter guards that we just, than no gutter guards. And although it's easier to deal with than the gutter guards we just looked at, because you could just lift them out. But now you've got other problems, like anything that is easy to take out will come out. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, one option is to not have gutters. Like you could have in this. I know you can see the gutters on the roof of the building, but that's because they have an entrance right there that they walk to. But you could like all those sliding glass doors. But this house could have no gutters on it and on the rest of the perimeter and be in perfectly good shape. Okay, so all this talk about gutters, and I've been promising to talk to you about, benefits of urban trees and why we care and how they should be in the landscape, because all of this is connected to other issues, global warming, the carbon challenge, all of those other things. So let me tackle this very briefly. Urban trees have an outsized carbon impact in a good way. Most cities were designed with urban trees in mind to help ameliorate the effects of the urban heat island before 1930. In 1930, air conditioning became a realistic proposition for residential homes. So you could just hook up something, plug it in. You didn't have to worry about trees to keep your house cool anymore. So urban forests started to really disappear from city plans. They weren't so critically important anymore. And now we're beginning to maybe rue that decision, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, so I get questions about what tree should we plant in our cities to sequester the most carbon. And I want to point out that I've got here in the middle of this on the left-hand side, that's the equation for photosynthesis. And you'll notice that every carbon molecule you want to sequester in a tree is linked to one water molecule. And that's assuming that trees are 100% efficient with water, but they're not. Trees are only about 20% efficient with their water. They're using the other water is used for cooling, which is really important because photosynthesis work has a temperature optimum and it's not 100 degrees. It's about 75, at least for C3 photosynthesis. We can get into that if you want to. But the point here is that for every carbon molecule you want to sequester, you have to use probably more like 5 or 6 water molecules. So, and we have limited water here in California. So the question isn't what tree will sequester the most carbon. The question is what trees will survive in California on the amount of water we can give them and still sequester some carbon. And then the other questions come into, okay, what tree? Where do you put it? And all those other things. So it's location specific. Generally speaking, if we have to simplify this, it's generally not on the north or the south sides of the tree. Locations of the west side are typically the best, and I will show you why in just a moment. Winter shade is an issue. I'm going to tell you why it's not a major issue and why we're not going to talk about it any further. So shade trees still, even when they're lost all their leaves, still provide 20% shade. So you'd be like, well, you know, that should affect your heating if it's casting shade on the house. The problem is, well, that's not a problem. You're right. That's a legitimate consideration. However, days are so short, the sun is low and weak. The amount of heating you would have gotten from that sunlight is pretty low anyway. So ultimately, winter shade isn't something that when you look at costs and pencil everything out in terms of carbon, it just, trees cast by trees with winter shade is not normally a major consideration. However, summer shade is a big consideration because the sun is high and intense. Newton shadows are fairly small, so the tree has to be right over your house in order for you to be able to get some benefit of it, especially if it's on the south side. But afternoon shadows are large and the days are long. So if you plant a tree on the west side of your house where for the afternoon sun, it's going to give you a lot of shade, a lot of cooling effect, and that is going to have a measurable effect on carbon usage. We'll talk about one. So here it is, sort of if you're a more graphical, you learn with visuals. In order to get your tree to shade your house to make an appreciable difference, you've got to plant it within quite close to your house if it's on the south side. This is not something the fire department, you're going to be doing a lot of gutter cleaning if you're doing this. You're going to have to really stay on it. And in winter, that tree is going to provide a lot of shade. So even if there is a weak winter benefit to not having, now you're losing any benefit you would have gotten because the shadows are going to be long even from a tree planted far away from your house. Tree location. In terms of sun, the north has no appreciable effect. Trees located to the east of your house will provide shade in the morning. That may be good depending upon where you are. If the tree plants to the south side of the house, you get slight negative effect for deciduous trees. You don't get much of an effect unless the tree is right by your house. We covered that in the summer. But you always get a pretty decent effect to the west because that tends to be the hottest part of the day is in the afternoon and the shadows are long. So even if it's 3 p.m., if you've got a canopy that's within 15 feet of the edge of your house, you'll still have a measurable effect in July and a much more measurable effect in September. Sun isn't the only factor here. Most people in California live fairly close to the coast within some measure. And even if you're not fairly close to the coast and you have different prevailing winds, then you'll have to worry about this from the direction of prevailing winds, winter prevailing winds. But we're going to talk about most coastals because that's where we are. So trees can provide appreciable winter heating savings if they can form a wind barrier. Now, so if the horizontal wind abatement is about 3 times the tree height at 35 miles an hour. Now, I'm going to say 35 miles an hour is the only place we really care about. At 4 miles an hour wind, you're not getting enough chill effect for it to even be all that noticeable. At 100 miles an hour, yeah, you get a much bigger wind abatement than 3 times the tree height, but the number of days we have with 100-mile-an-hour winds are so low that it doesn't factor in, again, statistically, for hardly anything. I mean, so really the only winds we're worried about are about 35 miles an hour. Trees on the north side of your house have a slight negative energy effect because it channels the wind onto the house without any benefit from summer shade, that kind of thing. So, and that's only a big problem if you have a big row of them that form that channel things. So if you have a big row of trees on the north side of your house and you're wondering why your heating bills went up, well, off you go. So let's talk a little bit about carbon costs. This has all been a great hand-waving exercise so far. Summer shade can reduce interior house temperatures between 8 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit. An 8-degree Fahrenheit reduction is about 10% energy savings for your air conditioning. This is a bigger savings in milder climates, which I thought was a bit surprising. But the reason why is because in interior climates like the Central Valley, your AC is going on anyway, almost no matter what. But on the coast, in these milder climates, this might be the difference about whether you turn your AC on or not. So we actually see the biggest savings here in San Francisco, the East Bay, Marin, in the warmer climates, those kinds of places, from having shade on the west side of our house. Reduced electricity usage means reduced carbon emissions. The big benefit of urban trees is that they reduce carbon emissions at from heating and cooling at 10 times the rate that trees sequester carbon. So it doesn't really matter what you plant. It matters where you put it, how big it is, if it was well thought out. So big trees do sequester a lot of carbon, but they also use a lot of water. Water pumping uses 25% of California's total electricity, is the number one thing. In Marin, I haven't done the work for San Francisco or other cities, but in Marin, the Marin Municipal Water District is the number one electricity user of anybody, right? So irrigation equals carbon emissions. So planting trees that require irrigation to make it through the summer, you're just trading carbon for carbon. You're not getting anything done. And just wait till we get desalination in Marin. That'll be really, it's not in the works yet, but I think it's almost just a matter of time. Then it's going to be even bigger issue. So what species of tree? I say look in the hills around you, a tree that'll provide summer shade and winter wind screening without using irrigation water. So if it's winter wind screening, you want something evergreen, and that limits your species selection down to, coast live oak, interior live oak, maybe bay laurel if you're really into that, but some California native species that's endemic to your neighborhood and well suited to your particular site. Let's think a little bit about global warming here. What's California, or at least what's a Bay Area going to look like in about 50 years? Well, it's going to be someplace between Santa Maria and Santa Barbara, depending upon who you listen to and what our projections look like. So if we want to look at what's really probably going to do well in the long term from here, we don't need to go too much farther than go down there. And you'll notice most of the climate zones are the same. They shift a little bit, but if you're right on the coast, they're still zone 17, sunset zones anyway. And, they're and zone 15. And you might end up with 16 or 14. And in really extreme cases, you might, and you're at altitude, you might end up at 3A, but it's pretty much similar to what we see in Southern California. In other words, for us, because we're not in the Central Valley, things aren't going to change that much. I mean, they might change a little bit. So I want to just say trees are valuable assets to the property. They have huge economic and sociological value. We should be putting a lot more thought into what we plant where for what kinds of effects, especially if we care about carbon and carbon future, right? And proper maintenance of trees and gutters is critical for fire safety. And if everybody did a better job of cleaning their gutters, the insurance agency would probably be able to breathe a lot easier about people having tree limbs over their houses, which is something we possibly want. I'm not trying to say you need it in every situation. You got to figure that out for your house. So if you want to save your house, don't start with the plants, start with the house, because the biggest threat to the average home isn't the plant, it's the house. And if it isn't your house, it's your neighbor's house. And this is sort of the LA fire story, right? Well, this is a picture not from LA, but from the Oakland Hills. The biggest threat from a wildfire is embers. And that lands on roofs, gets into vents, gets into gutters, those kinds, and gets into mulch at the base of the house. But the biggest threat from an urban fire, it is embers still lighting someplace in your neighborhood. But the problem is once it lights on one house, since houses are closely spaced, the biggest threat to your house, if you clean your gutters, is your neighbor's house. So how do we fight fires as neighborhoods? And it's about community, like we started this whole talk with. Neighborhood planning, neighborhood meetings, community. I mean, I'm a big fan of community gutter cleaning. If you're going to hire a company to do the work, get together with your neighbors and get a group bid so that you're not paying for the truck coming out over and over and over again, speaking of carbon costs, right? And then you need to think about escape routes. You need to have more than one. And that means you got to get engaged with city planning and figure out how this is all going to work when you got a whole lot of people trying to leave all at the same time. And we got to revise building standards to make sure it's not so challenging when the fire does get into the urban area. And how do we make it easy for people to do things? So again, Steve Quarles, one of the authors on a study that I have linked at the end. This is the NIST Technical Note 2205. It's about density and the thing. So low density is defined as less than 100 feet between buildings. Medium density is with 30 to 100 feet between buildings. And that's really, low density is pretty rural. You're talking about multiple acres per house, typically. So we're talking about, for our purposes, are mostly medium and high density, and probably most of it's high. So let's move on from there. Key terms. A couple of the key terms we're going to talk about are interface, intermix. I will show those. And the problem, there's a little bit of a problem here. These terms are used slightly different depending upon whose paper you're reading. The feds define it one way, CAL FIRE defines it another way, Common Interpretation defines it yet another way. I'm not going to go into the details of that. We don't care for the most part, their detail differences, right? They're defined in the document that you read, but interface is where you have higher structures, higher structural density, think condos near an open space area. That's interface. Intermix is where you've got big McMansion kind of things, except they're not McMansions. They have big yards and they've got space between them and they've got these winding roads that are cool to drive on and all that other stuff. So mix is like it's mixed in with the forest. Interface is it's just facing forest. So those are some of the terms that you'll want to have, and I defined them in more of the common usage there. And what the paper really shows is that it's about structural separation distance from fire sources. So fences are fire sources, clusters of trees can be fire sources if they can be lit by fences and or they don't have adequate land clearing around them. So the paper, I don't have time to go through it in detail, talks about why it's important. For instance, Residence 2, in this case, this is a case study they used. The only reason that Residence 2 survived was because firefighters removed a fence that was going to the house. The house above had chain link, so the fire couldn't travel along the chain link to get to the house. So that's why the Residence 2 survived. If it had the original fence going all the way up to the house, there's a good chance it would have burned. But the fire lands on these fences, especially double fences like we see in C1 and 2 down here. Each neighbor didn't want to look at the backside of a fence, so they built two fences right next to each other. And that's the perfect home for embers and weeds to grow up in. You can't control it. And that's where things really get going. Anyway, if you're interested in exploring this paper more, please do. It's part of the landers thing. So here's how we define intermix. It tends to be houses built into woodlands that have good space between them, whereas interface is houses that have less space that are still built into some sort of forest, but they the biggest threat to a house in an interface situation is usually other houses, whereas in an intermix, it's questionable. So here are some of the terms. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one, but the bottom line is, if you're at high density, which are these reds, we only care about the colors and what they mean. At high density, if your neighbor's structure lights, the probability of your house surviving is low. So you really need to work as a neighborhood in order to get by. The potential fire exposure is quite high. The impact of structure ignition of fire spread on the community high, and the likely effectiveness of just you fire hardening your house is fairly low. So don't worry too much necessarily about your house. Yes, you should do this so you're not the weak link in the chain. But even if you do it, if your neighbors don't do it, it's not going to do you that much good. If you're in a medium density area, that's where things really are kind of a mix between things. If you're in a medium density situation, the odds of your house surviving, if your neighbor's house burns, is a function of how much hardening you've done for your house. So that's where the house hardening really, really, really matters. And then at a low density, this is pretty much rural. It comes down to not just how much you armor your house, but how good a job you do at keeping the weeds away and keeping clearance. Okay, so talking points to just sum up a lot of this stuff so far. Evacuation routes should be treated as zone 1 or maybe zone 2. It depends on exactly what your property looks like, for 10 feet to the side of each road. Not just because you need to get out, but because firefighters need to be able to get in. And if the road's on fire, they're not coming in. If you're in a low density situation, it's just CAL FIRE clearances and ember hardening of all structures. If you're a medium density situation, then it is CAL FIRE clearance and hardening of all structures, but it's also making sure sheds and other structures are 30 feet from the house, and everything's 8 feet from fences. If you've got fences going up to your house, you need to replace them with steel gates or something similar. Armoring your house on the most exposed sides where the fences are the closest is going to be key to whether or not it survives. So that's like hardy planks and things along those lines. If you're in a high density situation, you got to do all the above. Plus, you're really going to succeed or fail as a community. You need to join your local fire safe council. You got to have sheds and other structures have to be at least a minimum of 8 feet from your house, and they have to be made very much non-flammable. Plan ahead, know your go bags, that kind of stuff. So when we talk about plant selection, there are a lot of plants to consider. I know we've been saying plant selection doesn't matter. And these are all the different factors that influence flammability and those kinds of questions and whether they're doing. Choose natives. They're already part of an established ecosystem. They're already going to have that community that's going to help them be fire resilient in the soil, right? Mycorrhizal fungi, better networks. Many of these species don't grow anywhere else, and they're very much adapted to local conditions, although maybe not local conditions 30 years from now. So again, think about maybe moving south. So we've covered this. We might want to think about moving some plants up from farther south if you want to adapt, but you're going to have to find the right place. You're going to have to do your homework on that one. There's a picture of our capital, which breaks all the rules for everything we've been talking about. But other Mediterranean plants can be quite good for working in California. The problem is many of them displace natives. They may become very weedy if they do really well. If they don't do well, it's often because they don't have a mycorrhizal community or a soil community that supports them incredibly well. So then why are you planting them in the first place? I'm not sure. It's a fussy plant, and you're going to spend a lot of time and energy trying to get it to grow. And then it may end up not being as fire hardy as natives because it's not as well adapted to the climate and the community. If it does too well, you've got the opposite problem. And if you're planting exotic hedges like Pittosporum, even better, because then you've got what? No horizontal or vertical separation, and you can make it a hedge between you and your neighbors and have 5 feet of clearance from your house, and it'll be crazy. I'm sorry. But one of our biggest problems is what do we deal with weeds? These can grow almost, these outcompete natives. They do really well. So ideas, star thistle, French broom, gorse, just because you can plant them and they do really well doesn't mean you should, right? So go talk to California Invasive Plant Council, CalIPSI, to go figure out which ones, at least they're telling you, please don't plant this. A lot of nurseries still sell things like ciabatta grass, and they're like, oh, it's sterile, but all it takes is a single gene mutation for that plant to go back to a fully virile plant, if you will. And that has happened over and over again in the landscape. So I can't recommend it. French broom, our favorite here. Once it dries out, quite good at carrying fire. 30-year seed bank. Please don't put this in your plant, on your property. Unfortunately, it may invade from elsewhere because people have brought it in on other places. In fact, the Marin Beautification Society intentionally planted it on Mount Tam because they thought it was pretty and they wanted to look at yellow flowers on the hillside. Yay! Thank you, great-grandmother and grandfather. That said, fire, we have been talking as though it's our something that we need to suppress and we're afraid of. Fire is more than that. It can be an ally. And I know you guys know this, so I'm just feeling like I want to point out that Prescribe as a weed management tool can be very effective if your property, in terms of cost especially, and it can be used if timed right for problematical weeds. So for instance, even French broom, which is something that often people say, oh, it survives fire really well. And it does. It's got this 30-year weed bank that's stimulated to emerge by fire. Yeah, the fire kills the existing French broom, but it stimulates germination, and it's got a 30-year seed bank. So you just get even more French broom coming back. But if you're trying to exhaust that seed bank, that can be a good thing. You're going to have to manage to do winter and spring burns for it to really work well against French broom. And you're going to have to look up your plant and get to really understand how it works. I'm just using French broom as an example here, but this is fairly typical of a lot of plants, that they are, Mediterranean plants are very juicy and wet. They're hard to get to burn in the winter and spring, but if you can get it to burn in the winter and spring, that's what kills them. So they can be difficult to run, difficult to get, air quality permits for sometimes, but it does give you opportunities for control. Even if you didn't go back and reburn, even if you went back with an herbicide or something after that with all those young plants, you could you stimulate the seed bank to come back, and then you do a fire and then you go back with an herbicide. That would be one potential method you could use. You may be limited in terms of what you can and can't do on a property, and I totally get that. Maybe double burns is a really good idea. I don't know. It's going to depend on your property. But with all the benefits, fire's a liability. If you've got cheatgrass or one of these other things that really thrives under fire and almost it can be really difficult to control these using even spring burning, because sometimes cheatgrass will have enough moisture still left to germinate after the burning and then set seed really late, and it's an annual. Anyway, it can be. So understand what you've got on your property. And none of this is really great for right around buildings. So, if you're working with star thistle or triclopyr is often used because it selects for grasses. If you're working with cheatgrass, I don't know what to tell you. You can, Roundup. I don't know. You're going to have to take every case on an individual basis. Okay. We've been talking a little bit about weeds and talking like that's the only issue. We do have some fungal issues that follow fires, and they can be a problem. They're not really as a huge problem like weeds can be, though, in terms of cost. Powdery mildew does follow fires fairly frequently. This is because powdery mildew is a specialist in high humidity environments and fresh growth. And after a fire, sometimes things calm down a little bit. And all the plants resprout. If there's any kind of humidity in the air at all, which often happens in, the dew, morning dew and things like that after fires, powdery mildew often colonizes many different plants, but oaks especially, and it will often kill a bunch of the new growth on these plants. And the oaks that are trying to recover struggle to do this, to deal with it. Surprisingly, powdery mildew is controlled by overhead watering or just rain, but it's adapted to following fire. Fires don't usually happen in the rainy season. So if you can get a fire to go in the rainy season to control some of your weeds, then often the rain can suppress the powdery mildew. It's a good thing all the way around. But a lot of times oaks and these things are held in rangelands or parklands where, getting overhead watering to oaks that burned is not necessarily an easy proposition. I mean, you're going to have trucks to get out there to do this. And if you've got to do this kind of work on specimen trees, you may just want to use oils. They provide much better control. And it's just like a neem oil. And if you can do it with a backpack or some kind of smaller rig, you can get, it may be more cost effective to do that one treatment with neem oils versus going out every several days and doing overhead watering, because that's probably what it's going to take under eye. And that's where we are. I hope I finished fair. I tried to go through and leave enough questions at the end. And these are a bunch of the things I've been talking about. It's in the literature. If you're somebody who really likes to go dig into the coral studies or the Safard studies or any number of other things about why trees are important, is Greg McPherson's talks here and down in the middle of the screen. If you're looking for weed suppression, Zuhar at the very bottom of the screen is a great reference. And Boyd at the very top of the screen is talking about how well they've been able to use fire to control French broom right here in, Marin and, in Marin, which I think is pretty relevant to San Francisco and surrounding areas. And I think that's, and if you're interested in the insurance industry's take on all of this thing, the Institute for Business and Home Safety, Wildfire Prepared, the third item down, is a good link to go check out. And then I've got, of course, if I want to plug myself, I'm down near the bottom there too. So those are the references I thought would be the most interesting. If you want to have particular questions or want to find other references, I'm happy to point you in the right direction. If I can't find it, I know somebody who does.